Have you ever witnessed a desperate struggle for survival in the midst of nature's fiercest fury? In this story, a determined Mustang battles against a raging flood, clinging to life as torrents threaten to sweep him away forever. Just when hope seems lost, a lone rescuer appears, risking everything to save a horse who refuses to surrender. The clash of raw strength against unstoppable water, the snap decisions made in a life-or-death moment, and the incredible bond forged in the face of despair form the heart of this remarkable tale. If you're someone who loves inspiring stories of courage and perseverance, be sure to listen through to the very end. You won't want to miss the final moments that define the fate of both man and Mustang. Subscribe now so you won't miss a single amazing story like this, and share with friends who might need a reminder that hope can appear when we least expect it. Night descended upon the high desert valley as though it had been conjured by some vengeful spirit. The first droplets of rain were light, little more than a teasing drizzle. Yet soon enough, the sky unleashed a punishing barrage of water that hammered the land without mercy. Low-lying fields turned into instant swamps, and the calm river swelled with such ferocity that it devoured roads, fences, and anything else in its path. Out in the darkness, a lone Mustang, known to the locals as Shadow, was trapped by the sudden onslaught. For years, Shadow had wandered these parts unchallenged, famed for his speed and grit. He was a creature so free-spirited that none of the ranchers could corral him for long, and he had outlived hazards ranging from scorching droughts to prowling predators. But on this night, caught in the furious torrent, Shadow's legendary determination was tested beyond measure. Everything began when Shadow ventured too close to the swollen river. One misstep, and the ground beneath him gave way. Before he could scramble to safety, a surge of brown, raging water seized him, tearing him away from the stability of solid earth. The current was relentless, turning him end over end, slamming him against debris and half-submerged branches that had been torn from upstream. His strong legs, which had carried him across vast plains, kicked in frantic bursts as he struggled to keep his head above the churning surface. Each time he tried to get a footing, another swirling eddy snatched it away. Hours seemed to stretch into an eternity for the Mustang, as his lungs burned and his eyes stung from the muddy spray. Though the water numbed his body, his will to survive still flickered. Yet even the bravest spirit has its limits. Already battered by submerged logs and shattered fence posts, Shadow was reaching the razor's edge of exhaustion. The shock of near-freezing water seeped into his muscles. Each frantic breath felt like inhaling shards of glass. He managed a last surge of frantic energy when an uprooted tree trunk, bobbing dangerously, struck him in the flank. The blow spun him around, forcing the air from his lungs in a painful exhalation. For a moment, all the world went dark for the horse, and he felt the yawning pit of dread open beneath him, the terror of final surrender. The storm overhead raged on, driving rain down in curtains so dense that they obliterated any possibility of sight or sound beyond a few feet. The valley had become a treacherous inland sea. Shadow, for all his pride and might, was nothing more than a helpless figure in nature's wrath. When his head dipped beneath the surface, Shadow's mind flickered with primal alarm, but exhaustion was already dulling his instincts. It could have ended right then, with the river claiming another victim. In that crucial instant, however, a pair of headlights cut through the gloom. The battered form of a pickup truck braved the flooded road. Inside it sat a man once accustomed to dangerous rescues, though he had tried to leave that life behind. His name was James Rowan, and something in his gut twisted when he saw the frantic silhouette in the violent water. He recognized desperation in every kick of the Mustang's legs. James had made a vow never to chase disaster again, but the decision before him brooked no delay. When the horse vanished beneath the roiling flood, he slammed his foot on the accelerator, ignoring the internal voice that screamed at him to stay away. James Rowan was no stranger to chaos. In his earlier years, he had served in the military, then transitioned to a career as a firefighter. He had pulled civilians from burning buildings and rescued the injured from crushed automobiles. He had even once saved a terrified dog from a raging apartment fire by smashing through a window on the building's top floor. Over time, though, a series of tragedies weighed on him. Comrades lost in combat, victims he couldn't revive at accident scenes, and he reached a breaking point. Burdened by survivor's guilt, James left it all behind to seek solitude. He wanted nothing more than to live quietly, away from the harshness of crisis and the crippling anxiety that accompanied it. His new routine largely involved the simplest tasks: driving his truck across open country, occasionally picking up supplies, and staring at the horizon while telling himself he was done with heroics. That was the plan anyway, until the sky cracked open that fateful evening. On any normal night, James would have noticed the rains and turned his truck around early, preferring to remain in the safety of higher ground. This time, however, the downpour moved in faster than anyone expected. Roads turned to streams, and streams to rivers. By the time he realized just how bad it was, he was already committed. The narrow county route he was driving on had become a treacherous channel of swirling water. The radio in his truck squawked sporadic warnings, snatches of the local sheriff's voice urging residents to evacuate low-lying areas and seek safety on elevated terrain. Yet James pressed on, jaw set, determined to cross the remaining miles. He nearly turned back when he saw how the water had consumed entire stretches of farmland. Fences were submerged, and the silhouettes of buildings loomed like ghostly shapes in the distance. The wind lashed at his truck with a force that rocked the chassis side to side. Headlights illuminated a nightmare landscape of floating wreckage, including tree limbs and the occasional chunk of metal roofing ripped from a barn somewhere upstream. James's heart thudded heavily, memories of past rescues and horrifying scenes surfacing in his mind. He gripped the steering wheel with white-knuckled intensity, trying to block out the swirl of old trauma. Then he spotted the flailing Mustang. At first, he thought it was just more debris, maybe a large log or a broken beam. But the shape moved in a way that drew immediate attention, flailing limbs and that unmistakable arc of a horse's neck breaking the water for a few desperate seconds. His pulse jumped. Despite every promise he'd made to himself, he found his foot slamming the brake pedal. The truck fishtailed on the flooded road, the windscreen half opaque with rain, but James kept his focus squarely on that figure in the water. For a heartbeat, he hesitated, aware of what he was about to do. Then the dark shape disappeared beneath a churning swell, and the decision was made for him. If he did nothing, the horse would die. James muttered a curse under his breath, remembering too many times he had waded into life-or-death scenarios, promising each would be his last. But sometimes saving someone or something is not a choice. It feels like a compulsion. He threw the truck into park and reached behind the seat for a coil of heavy rope. His mind already barked warnings about his physical limitations, about how the current was murderous. He didn't care. The Mustang was under again. If he waited too long, it wouldn't come up. The truck's door groaned as James pushed against the forceful wind. Rain pommeled him so hard that it felt like needles jabbing into every exposed bit of skin. The floodwaters were deeper than he'd guessed. His boots sank immediately, water swirling around his thighs, then his hips. The current pressed at him like a relentless swarm of hands. With every step, he feared he might lose footing and be swept away. Clutching the rope in one hand, James advanced. It took all his strength and balance just to navigate the few yards to the water's edge. But out there, further away from the relative safety of the road, was where Shadow was struggling, a flicker of black against the swirling gloom. A flash of lightning split the sky, illuminating the Mustang's location for a brief moment. Shadow's head surfaced for an instant, blowing out a frantic breath before vanishing once more. James's heart hammered as he let the rope uncoil, stepping deeper. The muddy torrent reached his stomach now, and the cold pierced him to the bone. His teeth chattered, but he forced himself onward. The roar of the flood was so loud it filled his ears with a ceaseless thunder. His head throbbed with the realization that if this went wrong, there would be no second chances. The rope, thick and sturdy, was his only lifeline. Without it, he would have nothing to pull himself back with if the current won. He stumbled over something underwater, a piece of broken fence or twisted metal, but he steadied himself just in time. Another lightning bolt streaked overhead, and Shadow reappeared, thrashing violently as a submerged log rammed his flank. The Mustang jerked as if stung, muzzle dipping below the surface again. Before James could think, he lunged forward, flinging one end of the rope toward the horse. It was a futile move, given the churn of water and wind, but it was all he had. He swore and tried again, struggling to keep his balance. The second time, the rope sailed closer. By sheer luck, or maybe the horse's diminishing fight, Shadow's neck surfaced and the rope brushed him, but it wouldn't stay. Cursing again, James made a decision. He would have to reach the Mustang physically. Years ago, he might have had more stamina, more raw strength, but his body was older now, shoulders aching from a past injury, and his lungs far less forgiving. Yet he pressed on, forcing his way deeper. The current practically roared, an angry force of nature showing no pity for man or beast. Broken branches clattered around him, scraping at his torso. He grunted in pain as something sharp gashed his thigh beneath the water. Still he pushed on until, by some miracle, his fingertips grazed Shadow's mane. It happened in an instant. 1 second he had the horse's wet, tangled mane in his grip, and the next, Shadow kicked out, hooves flailing in raw panic. The blow connected painfully with James's ribs, stealing his breath and launching him backward. Water swallowed him, a dark vortex ripping away all sense of direction. As he fought to surface, the current tugged relentlessly, and the rope threatened to slip free of his grasp. Under the swirling flood, James's world was reduced to shapeless shadows, bursts of pain, and the pounding of his heart. Desperate, he forced his eyes open in the murk, searching for a glimpse of something, anything, that might lead him back to air. His chest screamed for oxygen, and a nauseating panic clawed at the edges of his mind. Through sheer reflex, he kicked upward, finding no firm anchor for his boots. The water had become a churning brown vortex filled with debris that battered him from all angles. Then, miraculously, his head broke the surface. Gasping, retching, he gulped down a lungful of cold, rain-laced air. Blinking furiously to clear his vision, he saw Shadow's neck gliding out of reach, the Mustang only partially visible in the strobing flashes of lightning. The horse's entire body went limp for a moment, as though the fight had drained all his last reserves. Fear rammed into James's gut. If the Mustang lost consciousness in that current, he would vanish for good. James latched onto a splintered fence post bobbing in the water, using it to keep himself afloat. A swirl of adrenaline and desperation galvanized him. He looped the rope around one wrist and kicked hard to reach the horse's flank again. This time, Shadow made no effort to thrash. Maybe he had no strength left. James managed to drape the rope around the horse's neck, fumbling to find a way to secure it without choking him. Lightning flared again, followed by a deafening clap of thunder. "Easy, boy," James shouted above the roar, voice ragged. His ribs flared with pain, but he ignored it. "Just hang on." He tightened the rope just enough to keep contact. Shadow's eyes rolled in fear, but he seemed too exhausted to resist. With one arm around the Mustang's slick neck and the rope partially knotted near the chest, James tried to guide the horse toward a cluster of half-submerged cottonwood trees he had glimpsed out of the corner of his eye. If he could get them both wedged into some stable branches, they might rest enough to plan an escape. With every stroke, though, the current shoved them farther downstream, and the cluster of cottonwoods receded as a mocking silhouette against the darkness. Somehow in the scramble, the two drifted close to another wide-trunked tree that stood firm against the current. Its roots were partially unearthed, forming a tangled platform just above the waterline. James kicked with what strength he had left, gradually dragging Shadow closer to the trunk. Broken boards and uprooted shrubs swirled around, threatening to entangle them at any second. Bit by bit, he felt the horse's body press against the tree's outer roots. James forced himself to stand, boots scraping on submerged bark. With a supreme effort, he lifted Shadow's head above water. The Mustang's breathing was ragged, flaring nostrils spewing foam, but at least he was still breathing. Their momentary refuge was precarious. The massive tree offered just enough support to keep them from being swept away, but it hardly qualified as solid ground. Both man and horse panted in unison, steam rising from their bodies in the cool air, though the rain continued to slice down in sheets. James's muscles trembled from a combination of adrenaline and cold. His hands felt numb against Shadow's sodden coat, and the horse shivered uncontrollably. Yet for the first time since entering the flood, James managed to draw a few stable breaths and assess the situation. The violent waters still surrounded them, swirling at chest height on James. The current splashed against the tree trunk, forcing waves to slop over the tangle of roots that served as their improvised platform. Through the flickering glow of lightning, James spotted a slight rise in the terrain some distance away, a knoll or small patch of land not yet submerged. It looked heartbreakingly far in the raging waters, at least a quarter of a mile. Under normal circumstances, it might have been a trivial distance, but these were anything but normal. The Mustang was close to collapse, eyes half-lidded, side heaving with every labored breath. James himself felt the ache of battered ribs, the sting of cuts on his arms, and the draining heaviness of spent energy. "We can't stay here," he muttered, bracing a hand on the sturdy trunk. His voice carried no real confidence, but the truth was plain enough. The water was still rising, and if they lingered, they would be pulled under again once the level reached the branches where they clung. In the dim corners of his mind, he recalled the countless rescue manuals he'd studied when he was a firefighter, all that training about swift water rescues. But right now, training was overshadowed by sheer willpower and a battered body. Shadow let out a soft, desperate snort. It was as if the stallion, despite being wild, knew that any chance of survival lay in James's hands. James responded with a gentle pat, pressing his cheek briefly against the horse's wet neck. "You're not dying on me," he said, though exhaustion threaded through each syllable. He glanced at the rope, which was looped around Shadow's neck and chest. It was a pitiful harness, fashioned in the heat of crisis, but it would have to do. Summoning resolve, James began repositioning the rope, mindful of how easily it could harm the horse if too tight. He threaded another section around Shadow's body, trying to form a more secure band that would distribute pressure if he had to guide the Mustang in deeper water again. The horse merely shivered, lacking the strength for further protest. James took a breath, wincing at the pain in his ribs. The roar of the flood hammered his senses, and the stinging wind almost blinded him. The half-submerged tree under them shifted slightly, forcing him to clamp a hand on its trunk to keep his balance. The next challenge loomed clearly, a direct path through the strongest part of the current. Whether by miracle or madness, he had to try. If he and Shadow didn't push toward that patch of high ground, they would both be lost when the rising waters overtook the tree. Steeling himself, James tested his footing among the twisting roots. Each shift felt like stepping on marbles, as branches and debris tugged at his ankles. The water surged, threatening to yank him free at any moment. But if there was one thing James still had, it was grit. He'd survived harrowing experiences before, and something inside him now refused to let go of the wild Mustang that had struggled so valiantly to stay alive. He began to pull on the makeshift harness, coaxing Shadow off the root tangle. The horse balked at first, resisting with trembling legs, but James whispered whatever words of encouragement came to mind, as if the Mustang could comprehend. Slowly, Shadow shifted forward, half sliding into the swirling current. James followed, teeth clenched, mind screaming for him to hold tight to the rope. The initial rush of water nearly tore them both away. For a moment, they flailed in deeper water. James's boots lost contact with the anything stable, and he was forced to kick furiously. His chest burned as the cold clenched around him, each breath a desperate gulp of air. Shadow gave a feeble thrash, eyes wide with terror, but the horse was clearly near the end of his endurance. They drifted in a sideways arc, carried by the unstoppable force of the flood, while James fought to steer them toward that distant, higher ground. The half-lidded expression in the Mustang's eyes revealed just how close he was to shutting down entirely. Debris came rushing by again, a twisted farm tool, thick logs, and unrecognizable hunks of wood. James ducked behind the horse's shoulder, using the Mustang's body as a partial shield. It felt cruel, but he had no choice if he was to keep control of the rope. One sharp blow to the head could knock him unconscious and doom them both. Over the roar of water, thunder boomed in the distance, echoing like a furious drumbeat. An orange reflection flickered to the south, perhaps lightning striking something that briefly sparked. Step by agonizing step, when the current allowed them anything resembling a step, they advanced. James braced himself with his free hand, feeling for the ground beneath. Several times he slipped and went under, only to resurface coughing and sputtering, pulling Shadow's head above water to ensure he didn't drown. Each time the Mustang twitched with a feeble struggle, as though spurred by an instinct to live, even when all hope seemed lost. In one fleeting moment, James thought about letting go. A raw wave of exhaustion invaded every cell of his body, and the idea of oblivion almost held a perverse attraction. But a force inside him, perhaps that sense of responsibility he had tried so hard to abandon, forced him to keep going. Minutes bled into what felt like hours. The knoll of higher ground was closer now, maybe just another 50 yards. Yet those 50 yards could have been 50 miles in the teeth of that current. James felt his feet sink into a patch of mud, almost stable. Then the ground disappeared again. A swirl of swirling water dragged them in a slow spiral. Gripping Shadow, he angled them diagonally, praying it would bring them closer to that last arc of land. The break in the clouds happened so subtly at first that James barely noticed. The pounding rain lessened slightly, and the curtain of darkness overhead thinned. A ghostly sliver of moonlight slipped through the gloom, illuminating the valley enough to outline the shapes of swaying trees and swirling floodwaters. The worst of the storm seemed to be moving on, though the aftermath still raged in the valley below. James risked a glance upward and saw more open sky peeking through. He felt a small surge of hope, even as his body threatened to give out. Shadow's movements became weaker still, his breathing punctuated by wheezing snorts. James realized the horse was at the extreme edge of endurance. Though the Mustang's will was iron, there was only so much a body could handle. The swirling, muddy flood reached up to James's chest, and the undertow tugged at his waist. Any misstep threatened to plunge him under again. Grinding his teeth, he doubled his grip on the rope, focusing all his concentration on preserving whatever forward momentum he could muster. Slowly, meter by meter, they battled the flood together. Then a fresh challenge emerged. A cluster of branches, still connected to an uprooted tree, whirled toward them like a battering ram. Its snarled limbs formed a wide net of splintered wood. James had only seconds to react. He yanked Shadow to the side, pivoting against the current. The move strained every muscle in his chest and arms, and he felt something tear in his shoulder. Pain lanced through him, but he succeeded in dragging both of them out of the brunt of the tree's path. Still, the outer branches scraped across Shadow's flank. The Mustang let out a strained cry, rearing in panic. For a gut-twisting instant, James lost his hold on the rope. Shadow's weight shifted dangerously backward as water closed over half his face. Sucking in what might have been his final breath, James threw his arms around the horse's neck once more, trying to still the flailing limbs. The Mustang's eyes were wild, but the contact seemed to remind him of their fragile bond. Instead of lashing out again, Shadow slipped back to four trembling legs in the swirling water. "I've got you," James rasped, though he could taste blood in his mouth from where he'd bitten his tongue underwater. He slid the rope back under the horse's chest, resecuring his makeshift harness. The uprooted tree passed by in a rush, and they managed to avoid being rolled beneath it. That near miss spurred James to push harder, ignoring the throbbing in his shoulder. Each second out here was a wager with fate. If they didn't reach that knoll soon, it was only a matter of time before a bigger chunk of debris found them, or before the Mustang's body simply gave out. Summoning one last burst of strength, James swung his leg forward, searching for that patch of ground he'd glimpsed. His foot finally touched solid earth beneath the water's surface. It was spongy with mud, but still stable. Relief warred with caution. They weren't safe yet, but the end was near. With painstaking effort, James guided Shadow across the final stretch. The water level dropped from James's chest to his waist, and then to his knees. Each drop in depth felt like a blessing, allowing him more leverage to fight the current. Shadow stumbled and nearly collapsed as his front legs found the hidden, muddy slope. James tugged on the rope, calling out, "Steady, boy," in a voice that cracked from cold and fatigue. The Mustang's nostrils flared, and his eyes showed a dull glaze. But some flicker of instinct prodded him onward, step by quivering step. At last they reached the knoll, a small oasis of ground that stood a precious foot or two above the raging floodwaters. Stumbling onto that soggy patch of earth, James fell to his knees, releasing the rope as he gasped for breath. Beside him, Shadow crumpled, his coat lathered in mud, foam, and rain. The Mustang lay panting, sides heaving in great ragged surges that rattled in his barrel chest. They had made it, but the victory felt fragile. The flood still whirled around them in every direction, an angry sea that could reclaim them if the waters rose any further. For several long minutes, man and horse simply lay there, as though pinned by exhaustion. James's vision blurred at the edges. He was on the verge of losing consciousness. Memories of other rescues flickered through his mind. Dusty roads and faraway lands during his military days. Collapsed buildings he'd crawled through as a firefighter. In each memory, someone or something fought against impossible odds, and James had always gone in, heart pounding, determined to win them a second chance. He had thought that part of him was gone, buried beneath years of regret and self-imposed isolation. Yet here he was again. A gentle breeze carrying hints of dawn touched his waterlogged face, prompting him to stir. The rain was no longer a heavy downpour. It had eased into a light patter. Off in the distance, the storm raged toward another section of the valley, leaving behind a calamitous wake. James forced himself to check Shadow. The Mustang's breathing still came in labored gulps, but his eyes tracked James's movement. Carefully, James scooted closer and patted the horse's neck. "You hang in there," he muttered, voice hushed. "We're both too stubborn to die now." He realized that the night had started turning to morning. The horizon was a pale gray, revealing the destruction left behind. What had once been farmland was now a sprawling expanse of water dotted with wreckage. In the half-light, James could see that there was no easy path to true safety yet. The nearest railroad was likely submerged, and the main artery of the flooded river continued to cut them off. They were effectively stranded on this mini-island of mud. Shadow coughed softly, rolling his head to one side. The horse attempted to rise, but managed only to heave himself onto his belly, legs splayed. James knew that if Shadow stayed down too long, shock and cold might claim him. He pulled off his soaked jacket and draped it over the Mustang's flank as best he could, not that it offered much insulation. Still, it was a symbolic gesture, as if to say, "I'm here. I won't abandon you." Hours seemed to blur into each other as James and Shadow huddled on that ragged patch of ground, surrounded by the swirling waters. The drizzle finally tapered off, revealing a sky streaked with faint pinks and yellows. Dawn had arrived, but the devastation below was far from over. Across the valley, pieces of barns and entire uprooted trees continued to sail by in the relentless current. The watery reflection of sunrise provided a surreal, almost tranquil sheen to what was otherwise a wasteland of ruin. James's battered body resisted every attempt to stand. His shoulder throbbed from the earlier strain, and his ribs ached with every breath, courtesy of Shadow's panicked kick. Fatigue weighed on him, pressing him down like invisible chains. But every so often he forced himself onto trembling legs to scout the horizon. If the water receded even slightly, they might have a window to wade to safer land. On one of these attempts, he noticed that the level had dropped, perhaps just a few inches, which felt like a small miracle. The Mustang stirred. Shadow had spent most of the last hour lying still, occasionally shuddering with the aftershocks of cold and exhaustion. Now he began to shift his weight, as if some reservoir of determination bubbled back to life. James crouched next to him, placing a reassuring hand on the thick neck. The horse's eyes were more alert than before, though still haunted by the night's ordeal. "Easy there," James murmured, his voice quieter, gentler. "We're not quite out of this yet." Shadow let out a low rumble from deep in his throat, lifting his head to peer around at the transformed landscape. His ears flicked as he took in the sight. Endless water, the smell of damp earth, and the faint calls of distant livestock that had survived. Slowly, painstakingly, the Mustang propped himself up on quivering legs. For a moment, it looked like he might collapse again, but James slid an arm under his neck, offering what little support he could. The horse wobbled, snorted, then found enough balance to remain standing. A sense of relief washed over James. "That's it," he said, exhaling shakily. He couldn't help but feel a hint of awe at the horse's resilience. A normal animal might have given up hours ago, but Shadow possessed a fire that just wouldn't quit. And it wasn't lost on James how that same fire had reignited something in him as well. As the sun inched higher, James finally spotted a battered but still recognizable outline of a ranch house across the floodwaters, perched on a slight rise. He hoped that the occupants had fled to safer ground or were holed up inside. If he could somehow get Shadow and himself over there, maybe they could find shelter, or at least a place to rest properly until the emergency crews reached the valley. But traveling even that short distance would demand a measure of strength that might not exist in either of them. Time, however, was a cruel taskmaster. The flood had begun to recede, but it would be hours, maybe a day, before the roads were truly passable. James and Shadow shared that small knoll as morning stretched toward midday, each minute a testament to survival. Gradually, the horse found enough strength to graze on a few random stalks poking through the soggy ground. Meager nourishment, but at least a sign he was recovering. James kept a vigilant watch, rotating between sitting with his back against the horse's flank for warmth and pacing the muddy perimeter to see how the water levels changed. By early afternoon, a faint rumble of engines echoed across the valley. James's pulse quickened. Rescue teams might be making their rounds, but the battered landscape made it impossible to pinpoint their location. He considered trying to wave something bright to signal them, but his wet shirt and jacket were far from eye-catching. So he settled on an alternative, checking if Shadow was strong enough to move. There was a chance, slim as it was, that they could navigate a shallower route toward the main road. "We got a choice, boy," he said, stroking the Mustang's neck in an almost apologetic gesture. "We can wait here, or we can try for higher ground." Shadow's ears flicked forward, then sideways, as though considering the plan. James chuckled, the sound raw in his throat. "You're not the only stubborn one." Step by step, they ventured off their muddy sanctuary. The water that had once been chest-high on James was now around his hips. He led Shadow by that makeshift rope harness, guiding him cautiously. The Mustang seemed to have regained some strength, though he still favored one side. They trudged across what used to be a field, stepping over bits of debris and sunken fence posts. Occasionally, Shadow would pause, legs trembling, and James would rest an arm on the stallion's shoulder, giving them both time to gather energy. Progress was slow, but steady. Over the next hour, they inched forward until the ground firmed beneath them, and the flood receded to knee level. James's heart soared when they reached an actual stretch of gravel road that glimmered in the sunlight. It was wet and battered, with portions washed away, but it was road, and along it, standing in waist-deep water, were two emergency workers wearing neon vests. They spotted the man and the horse, and their shouts carried over the sibilant rush of floodwaters. Relief twisted through James like a physical force. He waved back, carefully picking his way forward with Shadow in tow. When he got closer, he managed a tired grin. "You fellas wouldn't happen to have a trailer for my friend here?" The workers gaped at the wild Mustang, clearly astounded that James had shepherded him through the flood. One of them reached for a radio, calling in the situation. James turned to look at Shadow, who stamped the water in weary triumph. In that moment, James realized he would never view the world the same way. A day ago, he was a man determined to keep life at arm's length, convinced he'd had nothing more to give, or to lose. But after fighting for hours with this wild Mustang, after dragging himself and the horse back from the brink, something new flickered in him. He reached out and rested a hand gently against Shadow's neck. The stallion snorted, shifting closer in a gesture of trust. "Come on," James murmured. "Let's get you home." Looking back on everything that happened, it's clear this story isn't just about surviving a raging flood. It's about rediscovering faith in ourselves and in others. Through all the bruises and broken fences, man and Mustang came away with a deeper understanding of resilience and compassion. In many ways, it shows that sometimes the very thing we save ends up saving us in return, rekindling the spirit we thought we'd lost. Thank you for following this journey. We hope this story inspired you as much as it inspired us. Please share your thoughts, reactions, and any similar experiences in the comments below. We'd love to hear your opinions. Remember to subscribe for more heartwarming tales and join our growing community of storytellers. Together, we can keep hope alive one story at a time.